On May 12, 1945, 4 days after the official surrender of Nazi Germany, a group of American soldiers from the Counterintelligence Corps captured a man in a mountain cabin in the Austrian Alps near Altaussee. He was carrying false documents in the name of a doctor called Josef Unterweger and had grown a beard to disguise his identity. However, the scars crossing both his cheeks, the result of the student fencing duels known as Mensur, were unmistakable. That man was Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the head of the Reich Security Main Office, the institution that coordinated the Gestapo, the SD, and the concentration camps, and that had executed with bureaucratic precision the extermination of millions of people. He was the highest-ranking Nazi captured alive at the end of the war, and his detention would mark the beginning of one of the most intense and documented interrogation processes in the entire history of the conflict. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was born on October 4, 1903, in Ried im Innkreis, Austria. His father was a lawyer, and he followed the same professional path, obtaining a law degree from the University of Graz in 1926. However, he never practiced in a conventional manner. From a very young age, he gravitated toward pan-Germanic nationalism and Austrian ultra-nationalist circles, and in 1930 he joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, still illegal in Austria at the time. That same year he entered the SS, the party's elite paramilitary organization. His rise within the SS was methodical and sustained. In a context where Austria criminalized Nazi activities, Kaltenbrunner was repeatedly arrested by the Austrian authorities, which paradoxically reinforced his position within the movement as a man willing to assume personal risks for the cause. In 1934, he actively participated in the failed Nazi putsch that cost Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss his life, although he managed to avoid the most serious legal consequences. His name circulated among the party leadership as someone efficient, loyal, and with no visible scruples. Physically, Kaltenbrunner was a disturbing presence. He stood nearly 2 meters tall, had enormous hands, and a face marked by deep scars that gave him not the appearance of a war veteran but of something more primitive and intimidating. He drank colossal amounts of alcohol, smoked incessantly, and his working style combined bureaucratic coldness with direct brutality. Those who knew him described a calculating intelligence that did not exclude personal sadism. He was not the type of official who executed orders from a desk without getting involved. Kaltenbrunner visited the extermination camps, attended demonstrations of execution methods, and directly participated in violent interrogations. With the annexation of Austria to the Reich in March 1938, Kaltenbrunner's career skyrocketed. He was appointed Höherer SS- und Polizeiführer for the Danube, which was equivalent to police and security control over the entire newly incorporated Austrian territory. During the first months after the Anschluss, he personally supervised the arrest and deportation of tens of thousands of Austrian Jews, communists, social democrats, and any figure deemed politically undesirable. Vienna, which before the Anschluss had one of the most vibrant Jewish communities in Central Europe, was subjected to systematic persecution under his mandate. The defining moment of his career came in January 1943. Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Reich Security Main Office and one of the architects of the Holocaust, had died in June 1942 as a result of an attack carried out by Czech and Slovak paratroopers in Prague. For months, Himmler searched for a successor who was simultaneously competent, loyal, and sufficiently malleable. Kaltenbrunner was the ideal candidate, or at least that was what Himmler calculated. He was Austrian like Hitler, which had symbolic value. He was a trained lawyer, which guaranteed a certain administrative capacity, and he lacked the charismatic and independent profile of Heydrich, which was supposed to make him easier to control. Himmler was wrong on that last point. Once installed at the head of the RSHA, Kaltenbrunner developed a network of influence and a direct line of communication with Hitler that allowed him to operate with a considerable degree of autonomy. Unlike Heydrich, who conceived the RSHA as an instrument of personal power with its own political reach, Kaltenbrunner understood his function as a direct extension of the Führer's will, which in practice granted him an almost unlimited license to act. To understand what Kaltenbrunner's capture represented, it is necessary to understand what the RSHA was under his command. The Reich Security Main Office was not simply a police agency. It was a bureaucratic structure of 7 departments that coordinated all mechanisms of repression, surveillance, foreign intelligence, and ultimately industrial genocide. Department 4, known as the Gestapo, and led at that time by Heinrich Müller, was the instrument of internal repression: arrests, interrogations, deportations of political opponents, and management of the camps in their initial phase. Department 5, the Kripo, or criminal police, dealt with common crime, but also with the persecution of categories considered socially dangerous, such as homeless people, homosexuals, or what the regime called asocials. Department 6 was the SD Ausland, the foreign intelligence service that operated agent networks in neutral countries and in occupied territories. Department 4B4, directed by Adolf Eichmann, coordinated the logistics of the deportation of European Jews to the extermination camps. The remaining 3 departments covered everything from personnel management and internal legal affairs to ideology and the surveillance of religious life in the Reich. What made the RSHA singular was not the existence of each of those departments in isolation, but their integration under a unified command. Before its creation in 1939, the various branches of the Nazi repressive apparatus operated with considerable institutional friction. The RSHA eliminated those frictions and turned what had been parallel structures with overlapping competencies into a single chain of command. Kaltenbrunner inherited that already well-oiled architecture and employed it with an efficiency that his predecessors had projected but not always achieved. Kaltenbrunner took command when the gas chambers at Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno and Majdanek were already operating at full capacity. His role was not that of the inventor of the system but of its efficient executor during the final phase of the Holocaust, the most lethal in absolute terms. Under his direction, some of the most massive massacres of the entire war took place. In 1944, when the German army occupied Hungary, Kaltenbrunner coordinated with Eichmann the deportation of more than 437,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz in less than 8 weeks, in what constitutes one of the most accelerated episodes of mass murder in recorded history. But the RSHA under Kaltenbrunner was not limited to managing the Holocaust. It also supervised the concentration camp system through direct communication channels with the concentration camp inspectorate, although this formally depended on the SSWVHA. The formal distinction mattered little in practice. Kaltenbrunner had direct influence over the executions of prisoners of war, over the forced medical experimentation programs that SS doctors carried out on inmates without their consent at Dachau, Ravensbrück and other camps, over counter-insurgency operations in occupied territories, and over the apparatus of terror that kept the populations of Poland, the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Greece and the Netherlands subjugated. The Einsatzgruppen, the mobile extermination squads that operated on the Eastern Front massacring Jewish, communist and partisan populations, also reported through the RSHA structure. Their activity reports, the so-called Ereignismeldungen, regularly arrived in Berlin and were processed under Kaltenbrunner's supervision. These documents, which recorded with bureaucratic detail the number of people executed in each operation and the demographic composition of the victims, would later constitute one of the most damning pieces of evidence against him during the Nuremberg trials. One of the areas in which Kaltenbrunner exercised the most documented personal authority was that of prisoner executions at the end of the war. When the Allied advance threatened the camps, it was Kaltenbrunner who signed the orders for prisoners to be executed before they could be liberated, or to be subjected to death marches under conditions that amounted to deferred murder. The camps of Mauthausen and Gusen in Austria were under his direct territorial supervision, and the conditions there during the final months of the war, with mass executions of sick prisoners and the use of the so-called staircase of death in the quarries, reflect the mentality that characterized the entire system. The RSHA was, in sum, the central nervous system of Nazi terror. It did not dictate the ideology, but it translated it into concrete action on an industrial scale and with administrative precision. That this system reached its maximum operational output under Kaltenbrunner and not under the more celebrated Heydrich is one of the facts that historiography has taken longest to assimilate, perhaps because it is more uncomfortable. It demonstrates that the machinery did not depend on the genius of a particular individual, but was robust enough to function, and to function better, under an administrator without charisma, but with an unlimited willingness to carry out whatever was entrusted to him. The capture in the Alps and the choice of interrogators. When Berlin began to burn under the Soviet bombardment in April 1945, Kaltenbrunner did not remain in Hitler's bunker waiting for the end like Goebbels or the Führer himself. Unlike Himmler, who attempted to negotiate a separate surrender with the Western Allies through Count Bernadotte, or Göring, who sought guarantees of favorable treatment through intermediaries and was detained by his own SS before the Allies found him, Kaltenbrunner chose flight. He was a born survivor, someone who had spent years operating underground within an Austria hostile to the Nazis, detained several times by the authorities, accustomed to moving between identities and loyalties in hostile environments. He trusted that experience to disappear. The choice of the Salzkammergut as his destination was not improvised. That region of lakes, forests, and mountains in the center of Austria was known among the Nazi elite as one of the most inaccessible territories in the entire Germanic space, far from the bombed cities, and with a network of mountain routes that could facilitate both concealment and an eventual escape to the south. Several hierarchs and high officials of the Reich had converged there in the final weeks of the war, and the area harbored not only fugitives but also entire fragments of the bureaucratic apparatus, classified files that had not been able to be destroyed, SD materials, operational documentation from the RSHA, and crucially, part of the plunder accumulated over years of systematic looting in the occupied territories. On Lake Altaussee, a few kilometers from where Kaltenbrunner would be captured, lay one of the most important repositories of stolen art from the entire war. Thousands of masterworks confiscated in France, the Netherlands, Poland, and Italy had been stored in the salt mines of the area, protected from bombardment by the geology of the terrain. Among them were pieces destined for the Führer Museum that Hitler planned to build in Linz, his hometown, as the definitive monument to the cultural greatness of the Reich. Kaltenbrunner was perfectly aware of the existence and location of that repository, and his presence in the area was not only that of a fugitive seeking a hiding place, but also that of someone who maintained a certain control over assets that could have value as bargaining chips. The identity documents he carried when captured presented him as Josef Unterweger, physician. The choice of a medical professional identity was deliberate. Physicians had legitimate reasons to travel between localities, to frequent rural areas, and to move with a certain authority that discouraged scrutiny. The alibi was mediocre, however. The scars on both cheeks, the result of mensur, the ritual fencing duels that were the mark of certain student circles and Germanic fraternities, made Kaltenbrunner identifiable to any agent who had access to his physical description. Allied counterintelligence services had him perfectly located in their files of wanted persons. When CIC soldiers found him on May 12, 1945, the contrast between the man and the legend was immediate. The head of the RSHA, the successor to Heydrich, the man whose signature appeared on thousands of death orders, was hiding in a mountain cabin without uniform, in threadbare civilian clothes and with documents that no one had entirely believed. The soldiers who participated in the detention described a man who was physically imposing, almost 2 meters tall and with a physical presence that filled any space, but whose attitude at the moment of capture was that of someone who had coldly calculated that the best option was not to resist. There was no struggle. There was no suicide attempt like Himmler's, who bit the cyanide capsule when he was detained days later. There was none of the tragic theatricality of Göring, who would save the poison for the moment of execution. Kaltenbrunner surrendered with the same instrumental coldness with which he had administered the deaths of others for years. He was transferred first to a provisional interrogation center in Austria itself, where the first contacts with Allied interrogators were exploratory. CIC agents needed to establish what he knew, what he was willing to say, and what strategy he would adopt. From there he moved to Bad Ischl, a small spa town in the Salzkammergut that served as a processing point for several high-ranking detainees. Informal interrogations began there before any formal legal framework existed for the process. He was finally transferred to the headquarters of the 12th Army Group in Augsburg, Germany, where the formal interrogation intensified in parallel with the legal and logistical preparations for the Nuremberg trial. The process would last months and produce hundreds of pages of transcripts that would become a primary source both for the tribunal and for subsequent historiography. The interrogations of Kaltenbrunner were conducted by a group of officers from the Counterintelligence Corps, and by members of the legal team already preparing the charges for the International Tribunal. Among the most active interrogators was Colonel John Amon, head of the interrogation team of the International Military Tribunal, a New York prosecutor with experience in organized crime whose technique combined sustained pressure with documentary confrontation. The method employed with Kaltenbrunner differed fundamentally from the coercive techniques that the Nazis themselves had applied in their interrogations. There was no physical torture, no extreme sleep deprivation, no direct threats. The Allied strategy was based on documentary saturation. Interrogators arrived at each session loaded with files, telegrams signed by Kaltenbrunner himself, orders bearing his signature, reports of RSHA activities that directly linked his name to specific decisions. The idea was to build a paper cage around the accused so that any denial could be immediately confronted with concrete evidence. This approach was both a legal strategy and a response to Kaltenbrunner's particular personality. Interrogators noted from the earliest sessions that they were not dealing with someone who would break down emotionally with ease. He was not like Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, who in his interrogations showed an almost pathological willingness to describe the technical details of extermination with the same indifference with which an engineer describes the functioning of a machine. Kaltenbrunner was more calculating, more evasive, and had developed from the outset a coherent defensive strategy, though ultimately a failed one. Lieutenant Colonel Smith W. Brookhart, Jr. was another key interrogator. His notes from the sessions reveal the structure of the interrogations. They began with general questions about the organization of the RSHA, then advanced towards specific functions, and finally introduced the incriminating documents at the moment when Kaltenbrunner had committed to a version of events that the documents directly contradicted. It was a classic prosecutorial technique, but applied with an unprecedented documentary richness because the Nazis had been excessively meticulous in their bureaucratic records, which proved to be one of the most devastating sources of evidence against them. Kaltenbrunner's strategies. From the very first interrogation, Kaltenbrunner adopted a defensive position that, in technical terms, can be described as selective denial with upward delegated responsibility. In simpler terms, he denied everything when he could, and when the evidence made denial impossible, he shifted responsibility to Himmler, to Hitler, or to the heads of the various RSHA departments. His central argument was that he was an intelligence man, not an operational one. According to this version, his role at the head of the RSHA was limited to gathering and analyzing information to present to Hitler and Himmler, who made all operational decisions. The departments formally subordinate to the RSHA, such as the Gestapo or Eichmann's office, would have acted with real autonomy under Himmler's direct instructions, without Kaltenbrunner having detailed knowledge of their operations. It was an absurd position in logical terms, given that the RSHA existed precisely as the unified coordinator of all those agencies, but it was coherent as a minimally viable legal strategy. In the interrogations about the Holocaust, Kaltenbrunner's position was particularly elaborate. He denied having visited Auschwitz, a claim that subsequent witnesses completely dismantled. He denied having given orders for the execution of prisoners, contradicting his own signature on hundreds of documents. He attempted to present the mass deportations of Hungarian Jews as an Eichmann operation that he had tried to moderate, when the records showed precisely the opposite, that Kaltenbrunner had pressed to accelerate the process when some officials showed resistance. A particular tactic he used with some frequency consisted of questioning the authenticity of documents. When telegrams or memoranda bearing his signature were presented to him, Kaltenbrunner insinuated that they might have been forged, or that his signature might have been used without his knowledge by subordinates acting on their own initiative. This line of defense was especially fragile given the volume of existing documentation, but it revealed the calculated desperation of someone who knew exactly what each piece of paper placed before him meant. Interrogators noted that Kaltenbrunner displayed behavior that alternated between arrogance and evasion. At certain moments he seemed unable to contain his pride in what he had built and administered, and in those instants he let slip details that he then tried to retract or qualify. At other times he was mechanically repetitive in his denials, as if reciting a prepared version. The Allied team psychologists who evaluated him pointed to a narcissistic personality with limited capacity for empathy, but with notable short-term tactical intelligence. The definitive collapse of Kaltenbrunner's strategy came about through the very nature of the apparatus he had administered. The Nazi regime was extraordinarily meticulous in its records. Every execution order, every deportation, every activity report was accompanied by documentation that was signed, sealed, and archived in multiple copies distributed among different offices. This bureaucratic obsession with record-keeping responded to an internal logic of the system. The Nazi chain of command demanded traceability, formal accountability upward and institutional cover downward. No one executed an order of major consequence without leaving a written record that they were doing so under superior instructions, and no one in a position of command issued an instruction without documenting it. What during the life of the Reich had been a mechanism of internal control became, after the defeat, the architecture of its own judicial condemnation. When Allied troops began occupying German territories, they found mountains of archives that the Nazis themselves had not had time to destroy completely, despite desperate attempts in the final months. In some cases, the archives had been transferred to mines or bunkers to protect them from bombardment, which ironically preserved them better than they would have been in the original buildings. In other cases, destruction orders arrived too late or were carried out partially by officials who were already thinking more about their own survival than about their superiors' instructions. The result was that the Allies captured tens of tons of original documentation from the Nazi apparatus, including complete archives of the RSHA, the Gestapo, the Einsatzgruppen, and the administration of the concentration camps. Among the most devastating documents for Kaltenbrunner was the correspondence relating to Mauthausen. The Austrian concentration camp, one of the most brutal in the system, reported directly to him given his territorial jurisdiction. The record showed Kaltenbrunner's visits to the camp on multiple occasions, and the camp's own internal documentation recorded those visits with the same administrative precision with which it recorded any other event. The most detailed testimony came from Commandant Franz Zierreis, mortally wounded during the liberation of the camp in May 1945, who made a statement to American authorities in his final hours. Zierreis described Kaltenbrunner's visits and his presence during demonstrations of execution methods, including the use of the gas chamber. That a dying camp commandant named his superior so explicitly, with no apparent incentive to lie at that moment, gave that statement particular weight before the tribunal. The so-called Ereignismeldungen, the situation reports that the Einsatzgruppen systematically sent to the RSHA from the Eastern Front, constituted another first-order block of evidence. These documents described in bureaucratic detail the number of people executed in each operation, their breakdown by category, sex and age, and the circumstances of each action. They arrived directly at the RSHA and were compiled into summary reports under Kaltenbrunner's supervision. What made them especially incriminating was not only their content but the physical markings on the documents themselves. Several of them bore marginal annotations in Kaltenbrunner's handwriting, corrections, questions, or instructions added by hand, which proved irrefutably that he not only received them but read them, processed them, and returned them with comments. This was not a filing system that someone managed on his behalf without his knowledge. It was active working material. The telegrams related to the Hungarian deportations of 1944 were particularly incriminating. In them, the RSHA signature and seal appeared on orders specifying deportation rates, destinations, logistical priorities, and, in some cases, explicit instructions regarding the treatment of specific categories of prisoners who were not to arrive alive at the camps. The bureaucratic terminology of those documents used the euphemism Sonderbehandlung, special treatment, to refer to execution, a linguistic convention that Allied investigators had already decoded in earlier phases of the process and whose real meaning was fully established in the tribunal's case file. An additional set of documents that interrogators employed in a sustained manner were the internal communications about medical experimentation programs. SS physicians at Dachau, Ravensbrück, Natzweiler, Struthof, and other camps conducted experiments on living prisoners, ranging from tests of resistance to cold and altitude to the deliberate inoculation of infectious diseases and the testing of chemical agents. Authorization for the transfer of prisoners to these programs passed through the RSHA, and several of those authorization documents bore the signature or seal of Kaltenbrunner's office. When investigators presented them during interrogations, the habitual strategy of denying knowledge of the specific content of each signed document became especially implausible. Transfer authorizations to experimentation programs were not routine administrative communications that could be signed unread. Perhaps the most dramatic document was a communication from January 1945 in which Kaltenbrunner ordered the execution of prisoners in several camps in the face of the Red Army's advance, with the explicit instruction that no prisoner was to fall alive into Soviet hands. The order, reproduced at trial, demonstrated that even when the collapse of the Reich was already a consummated fact, Kaltenbrunner was still issuing mass murder orders. The urgency of that final communication was also an involuntary confession. If prisoners were not to be captured alive, it was because they were witnesses, and the concern for eliminating witnesses presupposed a full awareness that the acts those witnesses could describe constituted crimes that had to be concealed. The psychology of the interrogated. The interrogations of Kaltenbrunner did not unfold in isolation. Simultaneously, the Allies were interrogating dozens of other high-ranking prisoners, and the information each one provided was carefully collated and cross-referenced. This network of cross-testimonies created an additional problem for Kaltenbrunner's defensive strategy. He had to contend not only with the documents, but also with the statements of his own former colleagues. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, captured in March 1946, provided one of the most devastating testimonies. In his interrogations and subsequent trial, Höss described Kaltenbrunner's visits to the camp, their conversations about the operational capacity of the gas chambers and the crematorium, and his participation in decisions about the pace of extermination. The coldness with which Höss described these interactions, with the same detached tone with which he described any operational aspect of Auschwitz, lent his words a terrifying credibility. Otto Ohlendorf, head of Einsatzgruppe D and responsible for more than 90,000 murders in Crimea and Ukraine, provided in his interrogations a detailed description of how the activity reports of the Einsatzgruppen reached the RSHA and were processed directly under Kaltenbrunner's supervision. Ohlendorf, who showed from the outset an unusual willingness to describe his own crimes with clinical precision, had no interest in protecting Kaltenbrunner nor any reasons to do so, which gave additional weight to his statements. Wilhelm Hürtel, an SD officer and one of Kaltenbrunner's most trusted men in intelligence operations in Central Europe, was paradoxically one of the most useful sources for the Allies. Hürtel, who worked actively with American intelligence services from before the end of the war as part of the OSS's first secret contacts with Nazi figures, provided detailed information about the internal workings of the RSHA and about Kaltenbrunner's specific role in the decision-making chain. It was precisely Hürtel who supplied the first documentary estimate of 6 million Jews murdered, a figure he provided in a notarized statement in November 1945. The most dramatic confrontation within the process was with Adolf Eichmann, although he was not captured until 1960 in Argentina. However, during the interrogations of 1945 and 1946, several testimonies described the operational relationship between Eichmann and Kaltenbrunner. Eichmann formally reported to Müller within the Gestapo, but coordinated his operations with Kaltenbrunner regarding the general policy of deportations. The statements that Eichmann himself later made before Israeli justice confirmed that Kaltenbrunner had full knowledge of every phase of the deportations and that he occasionally intervened directly to accelerate the process or to resolve logistical bottlenecks. The Allied psychologists and psychiatrists who evaluated the principal Nuremberg defendants produced detailed profiles of each one in what constituted one of the first systematic attempts to apply clinical tools to the analysis of perpetrators of state crimes. The work of Lieutenant Colonel Gustav Gilbert, an American Army psychologist with direct access to the prisoners during the proceedings, and of Major Douglas Kelly, a military psychiatrist who conducted the initial examinations, offers a unique window into Kaltenbrunner's psychology during the months of interrogation and trial. Both professionals subsequently published their observations, Gilbert in his 1947 book Nuremberg Diary and Kelly in 22 Cells in Nuremberg the following year, and although their interpretations diverge on some points, their descriptions of Kaltenbrunner are remarkably consistent. Gilbert described Kaltenbrunner as the most difficult defendant to approach emotionally of the entire Nuremberg group. The contrast with other detainees was striking. Goering deployed a calculated sociability and a tendency to dominate any situation, aware that he was performing for history and willing to exploit every interaction as a stage. Speer projected the image of the repentant technocrat who had served the regime without fully understanding its consequences, a posture that subsequent historiography would dismantle, but which during the trial proved effective in generating a certain sympathy. Hans Frank showed oscillations between religious contrition and megalomania. Even Julius Streicher, the most virulent anti-Semitic propagandist of the group, offered the observer a psychology legible in its pathologies. Kaltenbrunner, by contrast, displayed a combination of defensive arrogance and hermeticism that made any attempt at genuine access very difficult. In him there was neither Goering's exhibitionism nor Frank's penitent theatricality. He was opaque by system. In the conversations Gilbert held regularly with the prisoners, visiting them in their cells during lunch and at other informal moments, Kaltenbrunner never fully let his guard down. Every conversation, even apparently inconsequential ones, was processed by him as a possible trap. When Gilbert tried to lead him toward reflections on the crimes of the regime, Kaltenbrunner invariably resorted to the same mechanism. He acknowledged the facts in abstract terms, attributed them to subordinates or to the general structure of the system, and repositioned himself outside the perimeter of direct responsibility. He never denied that the crimes had occurred when the evidence made them irrefutable, but neither did he allow that admission to implicate him personally. It was a dissociative ability that Gilbert found disturbing precisely for its fluency. It did not seem a conscious effort, but an automatic reflex. What Gilbert observed with greatest insistence was the absence of genuine emotional response to the magnitude of what was being discussed. Other defendants showed variable signs of guilt, shame, discomfort, or sometimes indignation at certain accusations, reactions that might be calculated but that at least revealed a connection with the human dimension of the crimes. Kaltenbrunner seemed genuinely incapable of establishing that connection. When Gilbert described survivor testimonies to him or read him victim figures, the response was always instrumental. A denial, a redirection of responsibility, a tactical question about the source. Never a silence, never a pause, suggesting that something had reached somewhere. Major Kelly, who conducted the first systematic examinations including standardized intelligence tests, recorded an IQ of 113 for Kaltenbrunner, above average but lower than that of several other defendants. What Kelly highlighted was not so much raw intellectual capacity as the particular structure of that intelligence, a notable aptitude for instrumental reasoning, that is, for analyzing situations exclusively in terms of means and ends without significant emotional or moral interference. In a different context, that capacity might be described as executive pragmatism. Developed within a value system completely devoid of ethical constraints, it had become the perfect instrument for the administration of crime on an industrial scale. Kelly raised in his later writings a question that would prove uncomfortable for many readers. Whether that type of personality was a pathological rarity or whether it was, under appropriate institutional conditions, relatively common. His answer was more disturbing than reassuring. During the months preceding the trial, Kaltenbrunner suffered 2 cerebral hemorrhages, the first in November 1945 during the initial preparations for the proceedings. The trial was briefly delayed in his case while Allied physicians assessed his condition. Some analysts have speculated about whether those episodes were genuine or represented an attempt to buy time or to simulate procedural incapacity, a tactic that other defendants and war criminals had employed or attempted to employ. The physicians who examined him concluded that the hemorrhages were real and most likely related to the severe chronic alcoholism that had characterized his lifestyle for years. The amount of alcohol Kaltenbrunner habitually consumed was, according to several testimonies from people who knew him, extraordinary even by the standards of an environment in which heavy drinking was normal. The accumulated vascular damage was the most coherent medical explanation. When he finally appeared before the tribunal, he was in sufficient physical and cognitive condition to participate in his own defense, although physicians noted that he needed to be monitored. The defensive machinery he had set in motion during the interrogations continued to function before the tribunal with the same cold mechanics that Gilbert had observed in the cells. Nuremberg, the final stage. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg formally began on November 20th, 1945, at the Palace of Justice in the city that had lent its name to the racial laws of the Reich. The 24 principal defendants represented a cross-section of the Nazi regime's elite, ranging from political leaders such as Göring and Hess to military figures such as Keitel and Jodl, along with technocrats like Speer and financiers like Schacht. Among all of them, Kaltenbrunner held the position most directly linked to the extermination apparatus. The charges against Kaltenbrunner were 4: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The prosecutors from the 4 Allied nations, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, had divided the presentation of the charges, and it was the American team, under the direction of Judge Robert Jackson, that assumed the bulk of the case against Kaltenbrunner. The courtroom was a stage designed as much for justice as for history. Cameras filmed continuously. Photographers captured every expression, and simultaneous translators conveyed the proceedings in 4 languages. For the defendants, who had operated in the bureaucratic secrecy of state terror, public exposure was itself a form of prior condemnation. Kaltenbrunner sat in the front row of the dock. His defense counsel was Kurt Kaufmann, a German lawyer facing a near-impossible task. Kaufmann's strategy broadly followed the one Kaltenbrunner himself had adopted during interrogations, though with greater technical sophistication, to demonstrate that the RSHA was a structure in which responsibility was so fragmented and diluted that it was impossible to attribute to a single individual the authorship of crimes committed by multiple departments acting in a relatively autonomous manner. It was an argument that held a certain abstract bureaucratic logic, but one that crumbled before concrete evidence. And the evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors presented more than 4,000 documents during the general proceedings, several hundred of which directly implicated Kaltenbrunner. Each time Kaufmann attempted to create distance between his client and a specific crime, the prosecutors retrieved the corresponding document from the archive and read it aloud before the tribunal and the cameras. When Kaltenbrunner's turn came to testify before the tribunal on April 12, 1946, the courtroom paid particular attention. He was the first of the major defendants to take the stand in direct connection with the machinery of the Holocaust. His lawyer Kaufmann began with a direct examination, attempting to construct the narrative of a man whose function was primarily foreign intelligence, with no real control over the domestic operations of terror and extermination. Kaltenbrunner's response to Kaufmann's questioning was a clinical demonstration of his defensive strategy. He described his appointment to the RSHA as that of a trusted man of Himmler's, whose function was to rebuild the Foreign Intelligence Service that Heydrich had neglected in his final years, having become more interested in domestic politics. He presented the SD Ostland as his true domain of activity and described the Gestapo, the concentration camps, and the deportation operations as structures dependent on other chains of command. When the turn passed to the prosecution for cross-examination, the confrontation was immediate. Colonel John Amon, who had conducted many of the prior interrogations, knew exactly which documents to use and at what moment. The technique was the same he had employed in earlier sessions: allow Kaltenbrunner to establish a claim, then present the documentation that refuted it. One of the most tense moments of the cross-examination came when Amon presented the testimony of Zierreis regarding Kaltenbrunner's visits to Mauthausen. Kaltenbrunner attempted to discredit Zierreis by arguing that he had testified under duress while dying from his wounds. Amon responded by presenting testimonies from multiple camp survivors who independently described the same visits. The accumulation of converging testimonies made it difficult to maintain the position that all witnesses were lying or mistaken. The most remembered episode of the judicial examination was the confrontation over the Struthof telegram. The Natzweiler Struthof concentration camp in Alsace had been the site of medical experiments with toxic gas carried out on living prisoners. A telegram bearing Kaltenbrunner's signature authorized the transfer of certain prisoners to that camp to be used in the experiments. When Amen presented the document and asked directly whether that was his signature, Kaltenbrunner took several seconds before responding. He then claimed that the signature may have been placed by an RSHA official acting on his behalf without his knowledge. It was a response the tribunal clearly did not find convincing. The testimony regarding execution orders from the final phase of the war was equally revealing. Amen presented a series of communications in which the RSHA under Kaltenbrunner explicitly ordered the liquidation of prisoners in the face of the Allied advance. Faced with each document, Kaltenbrunner responded with variations of the same assertion, that he did not recall having signed that specific order, that the documents had possibly been signed in series without his having reviewed their individual content, or that the real responsibility lay with Himmler. The judges took note of every response. The witnesses. In addition to the documents and Kaltenbrunner's own interrogation, the tribunal heard from a series of witnesses whose statements constructed a picture of responsibility so complete that it was difficult to identify any logical escape point in the defense. The testimonial architecture of the proceedings was partly deliberate and partly the result of the organic accumulation of people who had been at different points within the system and who, from those different points, convergently described the same realities. Each witness saw a part of the apparatus. The tribunal saw the apparatus whole. Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier, a French journalist and communist militant deported to Auschwitz in January 1943 and subsequently transferred to Ravensbrück, was one of the most impactful witnesses of the trial in general, not specifically of the Kaltenbrunner case. She testified on January 28, 1946, in the early months of the proceedings, and her testimony established the framework of reality within which all subsequent denials by the defendants linked to the extermination apparatus had to be evaluated. Her description of conditions at Auschwitz was exhaustive and methodical. The selections on the railway platform where SS doctors separated those who would go directly to the gas chambers from those who would be used as labor, the operation of the crematoria, life in the barracks, the medical experiments, the executions. What made her testimony especially disturbing was not only the content but the form. Vaillant-Couturier spoke with a clinical precision and a serenity that was not indifference but the result of having processed for years what she had witnessed. The courtroom fell into complete silence at several moments during her statement. When the German Defense Counsel attempted the cross-examination, his questions sounded like what they were, desperate attempts to cast doubt on a testimony that was structurally sound. Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski represented a radically different type of witness. A senior SS officer responsible for the operations of the Einsatzgruppen on the central sector of the Eastern Front and commander of the forces that crushed the Warsaw Uprising in 1944 with a brutality that cost the lives of between 150,000 and 200,000 Polish civilians, Bach-Zelewski was not a victim but a perpetrator who had decided to cooperate with the Allies. His willingness to testify against his former comrades responded to a transparently personal survival logic. He hoped that his cooperation would earn him favorable procedural treatment. The prosecutors were perfectly aware of that motivation and acknowledged it explicitly, but the value of his testimony did not depend on its moral purity, but on its coherence with the rest of the evidence. Bach-Zelewski confirmed that the activity reports of the Einsatzgruppen reached the RSHA directly, described the functioning of the command system that connected operations in the field with decisions in Berlin, and provided details about conversations and meetings he had attended that directly involved the upper echelons of the RSHA. Nothing he said contradicted the documents. Everything he said completed them. Rudolf Höss testified on April 15, 1946, 3 days after Kaltenbrunner had begun his own testimony before the tribunal. The chronological proximity had something of a procedural choreography, while Kaltenbrunner attempted from the stand to construct the fiction of his operational detachment from the extermination system. The commandant of Auschwitz described that system from the inside, with a precision that left no room for any fiction. Höss had been captured in March 1946 and had shown from the very first moment of his interrogations a willingness to describe the functioning of Auschwitz with the same technical and dispassionate tone with which an engineer describes the operation of an industrial plant. He expressed neither remorse nor pride, only precision. When asked directly about Kaltenbrunner, Höss confirmed visits to the camp and conversations about the operational capacity of the gas and cremation facilities. He did not hesitate. He did not qualify, he did not need to. He was describing facts he remembered clearly because they had been part of his daily work. In addition to these three principal witnesses in relation to the Kaltenbrunner case, the tribunal heard from survivors of multiple camps, from former officers who described the functioning of the command apparatus, and from witnesses who had had direct contact with various departments of the RSHA. Each contributed a fragment. The accumulation of fragments produced an image that was the exact negation of the version Kaltenbrunner had attempted to construct during months of interrogation. The cumulative effect of all that evidence, documents, direct testimonies, cross-statements among perpetrators, was that of a structure of responsibility built from multiple independent angles, each of which reinforced the others without anyone depending on the others to stand. That structural independence was precisely the problem for the defense. Had the prosecution rested on a single witness or a single type of document, it would have been possible to attack its credibility in a focused manner. But Kaltenbrunner's strategy, which depended on the individual denial of each element, required that all witnesses lie, that all documents be forged or misinterpreted, and that all coincidences between independent sources be accidental. It was a position the tribunal did not find sustainable, and which the trial transcripts show he himself did not entirely believe. Despite the exhaustiveness of the interrogations and the trial, some aspects of Kaltenbrunner's activities remained incompletely clarified, and several constitute historical enigmas that researchers have continued to examine in subsequent decades. One of the most persistent concerns what is known as Action 1005, the systematic operation to destroy evidence of mass extermination on the Eastern Front. The SS exhumed and burned the bodies of hundreds of thousands of people murdered by the Einsatzgruppen in an attempt to erase the physical traces of the crimes. This operation required enormous logistical coordination and depended directly on the RSHA. Yet during the interrogations and the trial, Kaltenbrunner's specific responsibility in its planning and execution was never established with the same documentary precision as other crimes. Another area insufficiently explored during the interrogations was Kaltenbrunner's relationship with the secret negotiations of the final phase of the war. There are indications that he himself or emissaries under his control participated in contacts with Allied agents through Swiss or Swedish intermediaries, partly to explore possibilities for a separate surrender, and partly, according to some interpretations, to attempt to create an escape network for key figures of the regime. Whether Kaltenbrunner had knowledge of the so-called Operation Odessa, the alleged network organized to facilitate the escape of Nazi war criminals through Spain, Portugal, and Argentina, is something Allied interrogators were never able to definitively prove. The question of stolen assets also remained partially unresolved. Kaltenbrunner was operating in the Salzkammergut when he was captured, and that region harbored both confiscated works of art and deposits of precious metals and foreign currency extracted from the victims of the extermination. The precise extent of Kaltenbrunner's participation in organizing those deposits and in plans to use them as escape currency was investigated, but without definitive conclusions. There were also questions about Kaltenbrunner's intelligence network regarding the Allies. In his functions coordinating the SD Ostland, he had overseen intelligence operations that included agents within Allied structures. The true extent of that network, the names of the informants, and the degree to which the information gathered influenced military decisions of the Reich are matters on which the interrogations obtained no complete answers, in part because Kaltenbrunner acknowledged that he would use that type of information as bargaining currency if the opportunity presented itself, and the Allies preferred not to pose questions whose answers might compromise intelligence operations still active. The verdict. The International Military Tribunal pronounced its verdict on October 1, 1946. Kaltenbrunner was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, the two charges most directly linked to his activity in the RSHA. He was found not guilty of the charge of conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, as the tribunal considered that his appointment to lead the RSHA had occurred when the war was already underway, and that there was no evidence he had participated in the original planning of the wars of aggression. The sentence was death. The execution was carried out in the early hours of October 16, 1946, in the gymnasium of the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. Kaltenbrunner was the 11th to mount the scaffold that night among the group of 10 condemned men who would be hanged. His last words were, "Germany, good luck." There was no plea for forgiveness, no acknowledgement of guilt, not the slightest reference to the victims. The verdict and the manner in which it was reached had consequences that extend beyond the fate of a single individual. The trial of Kaltenbrunner was one of the first instances in which the bureaucratic administration of mass crime was treated legally as individual responsibility and not as mere compliance with orders. The argument that he had simply administered an inherited structure, that decisions were made by others, that he was not personally responsible for each act committed by his subordinates, was explicitly rejected by the tribunal. This rejection carries a doctrinal dimension that transcended the specific case. It established that whoever occupies the position of command in a criminal organization cannot evade responsibility by appealing to bureaucratic complexity. The signature on the documents was not an administrative formality, it was the expression of a will that had real consequences on human lives, and that will was attributable to whoever exercised it regardless of how many intermediate links existed in the chain of execution. The Kaltenbrunner case also revealed, in a way that the interrogations made especially visible, the psychological mechanisms by which people with full awareness of their actions construct systems of self-exculpation that allow them to continue functioning within criminal structures. Denial, the delegation of responsibility, the dissociation between the decisions made and their practical consequences, all these mechanisms were documented with a precision that the social sciences and forensic psychology would continue to analyze for decades. The interrogations of Ernst Kaltenbrunner, together with those conducted of the other Nuremberg defendants, established a methodological precedent in the investigation of state crimes that profoundly influenced subsequent proceedings, from the Tokyo trials to the international tribunals created to judge the crimes in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda in the 1990s. The documentary saturation strategy that the Allies employed against Kaltenbrunner proved more effective than any form of physical or psychological pressure. The meticulous documentation of the Nazi regime itself, a characteristic reflecting both German bureaucratic culture and the SS apparatus's obsession with order and record-keeping, proved to be the most powerful instrument available for the judicial reconstruction of the crimes. This lesson, that state crimes leave documentary traces that perpetrators rarely succeed in destroying completely, would become a fundamental principle of international forensic investigation. The interrogations also established the importance of the network of cross-testimonies. No single witness, no isolated document would have been sufficient to build the case against Kaltenbrunner. The convergence of multiple independent sources, each of which described from its own angle the same facts, created a solidity of evidence that individual denials could not erode. This methodology, in which the credibility of evidence is built through coherence among independent sources rather than through the authority of any single source, would become a standard of international criminal tribunals. The role of the psychologists and psychiatrists integrated into the interrogation team, Gilbert and Kelly in the Nuremberg case, anticipated a practice that is today standard in investigations of crimes against humanity: the psychological evaluation of perpetrators, not only as a tool for understanding their individual psychology, but as an instrument for designing interrogation strategies adapted to the specific personality of each individual. The archives of the interrogations of Kaltenbrunner, preserved in the United States National Archives and in the German Bundesarchiv, remain primary reference sources for historians of the Third Reich. They contain information about the internal functioning of the RSHA that in some cases is not available in any other documentary source, because the Nazis destroyed part of their own archives and because some operational structures of the security apparatus functioned deliberately outside formal recording channels. Among all the crimes attributed to Kaltenbrunner, those related to Mauthausen carry a geographical and personal specificity that makes them especially relevant to understanding his direct responsibility. The Mauthausen concentration camp, established in 1938 in a granite quarry near Linz in Upper Austria, lay at the heart of his original operational territory. Mauthausen was classified as a Grade 3 camp, the most severe in the Nazi concentration system, intended for prisoners considered unrecoverable for any form of work useful to the Reich. The methods of extermination included forced labor to death in the quarries, the throwing of prisoners from the edge of a cliff known as the paratrooper's wall, systematic executions by a shot to the back of the neck, and from 1941 onward, a gas chamber installed inside the camp. The staircase of death, a flight of 186 steps that prisoners were forced to climb carrying granite blocks weighing between 25 and 50 kilograms, was one of the camp's most notorious instruments of torture. The guards selected the weakest prisoners for maximum loads and then pushed them or let them fall, in a practice that blended forced labor with ritualized murder. The witnesses who testified in the Mauthausen trial, judged separately by an American military tribunal in 1946, described on multiple occasions the presence of high-ranking visitors who attended these scenes. Among the most frequently identified visitors was Kaltenbrunner. The testimony of several former camp guards who testified under the pressure of facing their own convictions coincided in describing Kaltenbrunner as someone who observed the procedures with an attitude that witnesses described as one of satisfaction or absolute indifference, never of discomfort or disapproval. The fact that the camp was in Austria, Kaltenbrunner's homeland, and that he had built his career precisely in that region made it especially difficult to maintain the fiction that he was unaware of what was happening there. Mauthausen was less than 100 kilometers from Linz, where Kaltenbrunner had his family roots. Commandant Zierreis reported directly to him within the territorial chain of command. The camp archives showed regular communications with the RSHA. The bureaucratic distance that Kaltenbrunner attempted to invoke in his defense was reduced, in the case of Mauthausen, to a geographical distance of less than 1 hour's travel. The Hungarian case and the post-war executions. If there is one episode that concentrates with particular intensity Kaltenbrunner's direct responsibility in the Holocaust, it is the deportation of Hungarian Jews in 1944. In statistical and chronological terms, what happened in Hungary between May and July of 1944 has no parallel in the entire history of the extermination. More than 437,000 people were deported in less than 8 weeks at a rate of killing that saturated the operational capacity of Auschwitz. The context was that of the German occupation of Hungary in March 1944. Admiral Horthy, the Hungarian regent, had until that point maintained a degree of independence with respect to German demands to deport the Jewish community, the largest that still remained relatively intact in German-controlled Europe. With the occupation, that shield disappeared. Eichmann arrived in Budapest at the head of a Sonderkommando specially constituted to organize the deportations, and Kaltenbrunner supervised the operation from Berlin and through personal visits to Hungary. The documents of the period show that Kaltenbrunner was not a passive executor of superior instructions in this case. When friction arose between the Hungarian administration and German officials over the pace of the deportations, or when certain sectors of the Hungarian bureaucracy attempted to slow the process, Kaltenbrunner intervened directly in the negotiations. His communications with Eichmann during that period, several of which survived and were presented as evidence, show someone actively committed to maintaining the maximum rate of deportations. The operational logic of the Hungarian deportation was cynical in its precision. The German army was being driven out of the Soviet Union by the Soviet advance, and the Reich's commanders knew that time was running out. If the Hungarian Jews were to be murdered within the framework of the extermination plan, it had to happen before the military collapse made the logistics impossible. Kaltenbrunner was perfectly aware of this urgency, and the communications of the period show that he shared and drove it. The final number of victims of the Hungarian deportations, around 75% of whom were killed immediately upon arrival at Auschwitz, makes this episode one of the most lethal of the Holocaust in absolute terms within such a short period of time. Kaltenbrunner's responsibility in it, though distributed through the chain of command that included Eichmann, Höss, and the local operational cadres, was that of the official who, from the apex of the RSHA, guaranteed the resources, the coordination, and the political pressure necessary for the operation to be executed at that speed. The period between the autumn of 1944 and the spring of 1945, when the military collapse of the Reich was already irreversible, was in certain respects the bloodiest in the entire history of the RSHA under Kaltenbrunner. Faced with the Allied advance from the west and the Soviet advance from the east, the orders emanating from the RSHA prioritized the destruction of evidence and the elimination of witnesses in a spiral of murders that continued to accelerate even when defeat was an accomplished fact. The death marches represented one of the most massive forms of this final killing. When the concentration camps in the Eastern Territories had to be evacuated in the face of the Soviet advance, prisoners were forced to walk hundreds of kilometers in winter conditions, without adequate food and guarded by guards with orders to execute anyone who could not maintain the pace. Thousands died on these marches, and the directives governing them came from the RSHA. The direct executions of prisoners in the camps before they could be liberated followed a similar pattern. At Mauthausen, at Gusen, at Dachau, and at numerous subsidiary camps, prisoners who had survived years of gradual extermination were murdered en masse in the days and weeks preceding the Allied arrival. In some cases, gas was used in the final days of operation. In others, mass shootings. At Mauthausen, in the days immediately before liberation, sick prisoners who could not be moved were executed by the guards themselves. The documented orders arriving from the RSHA during this period carry a character that goes beyond the usual bureaucratic coldness. There is in them an urgency suggesting that Kaltenbrunner and those acting under his command understood perfectly that the imminent Allied arrival would mean the exposure of the crimes, and they sought to eliminate both physical evidence and living witnesses. It was the final expression of a logic that had guided the entire apparatus from the beginning. The crimes had to be executed with maximum efficiency and with the minimum possible trace. When the Allied interrogators confronted Kaltenbrunner with these orders from the final months of the war, his defensive strategy showed especially visible cracks. It was difficult to argue ignorance or delegated responsibility when the documents in question bore dates from weeks before the surrender, when he himself was already in flight, and when the only logical explanation for those orders was the elimination of witnesses before the Allied arrival. The urgency of those final communications betrayed an awareness of guilt that months of interrogation had not been able to extract in any other way. One of the most disturbing dimensions that emerged from the interrogations of Kaltenbrunner was what might be called the instrumental banality of the signature. Thousands of people died as a direct result of documents signed by Kaltenbrunner: deportation orders, execution authorizations, instructions for the transfer of prisoners to extermination camps, directives on the treatment of specific categories of detainees. In the interrogations, this issue generated some of the most tense exchanges. The investigators would present him with a document bearing his signature and ask whether he acknowledged having signed it. When the signature was clearly his, Kaltenbrunner employed one of several strategies. He would say he did not remember having signed that specific document given the enormous volume of documentation he processed daily. He would say his signature may have been applied by an official authorized to use it on his behalf for routine documents. Or he would say the signature was authentic, but that the content of the document did not reflect his actual instructions because some subordinate had drafted the text inconsistently with his verbal orders. This last tactic was especially revealing because it implied admitting that there existed a signing system that functioned in a relatively autonomous manner with respect to the content of the documents, which was precisely what the prosecutors were arguing, that the RSHA was a bureaucratic murder machine operating under its own inertia, and that whoever directed it was responsible for that inertia, regardless of how much personal attention he paid to each specific document. The debate surrounding Kaltenbrunner's signature anticipated a legal and philosophical discussion that would continue for decades. To what extent is the executive of an organization personally responsible for the acts of that organization? The answer the Nuremberg Tribunal gave in the Kaltenbrunner case was unequivocal. When the acts of the organization are systematically criminal, when they constitute a policy and not individual aberrations, and when the executive has knowledge of that policy and keeps it in operation, the personal responsibility of the executive is full and indivisible. This principle, articulated implicitly in the verdict against Kaltenbrunner and developed explicitly in the subsequent Nuremberg jurisprudence and in the statutes of modern international tribunals, carries implications that extend far beyond the specific case. It establishes that bureaucratic complexity is not a defense, that the distance between whoever signs an order and whoever pulls the trigger does not dilute criminal responsibility, that the crime of the state is ultimately the crime of individuals who chose each day to keep the machine running. The interrogation as historical source. The documents of the interrogations of Kaltenbrunner, transcribed and archived by the Allied team, constitute today a historical source of the first magnitude that goes beyond their value as procedural material. Kaltenbrunner's answers, even when they lie, provide information about the internal functioning of the RSHA that is not available in any other source, because they are the answers of someone who was a central part of the system and who, even while attempting to minimize his role, inevitably reveals aspects of how that system worked. The questions Kaltenbrunner answered with evasion are as informative as those he answered with relative precision. When he evaded a question about the chain of command for specific operations, he was implicitly confirming that that chain of command existed and that he was aware of its existence. When he minimized the importance of certain departments of the RSHA, he was revealing which areas generated the greatest legal exposure for him. When he attempted to shift responsibility toward Himmler for specific operations, he was involuntarily describing the decision-making structure within the Nazi leadership. The historians who worked with these sources in subsequent decades, including Gerald Reitlinger, Raoul Hilberg, and later Christopher Browning and Peter Longerich, used the interrogation transcripts as reference points for understanding the bureaucratic architecture of the Holocaust. Hilberg, in particular, whose work, The Destruction of the European Jews, is the most exhaustive reconstruction of the extermination process found in the documents of the Nuremberg interrogations, including those of Kaltenbrunner, crucial evidence for his analysis of the role of the RSHA as the central coordinator of the extermination process. The cross-referencing of the interrogation transcripts with the documentary archives of the RSHA that survived also made it possible to reconstruct aspects of the functioning of the extermination system that would otherwise have remained obscure. For example, the relationship between the Einsatzgruppen reports and the operational decisions of the central RSHA, or the mechanism by which deportations from different countries were coordinated to maintain a constant flow toward the extermination camps according to their capacity at any given moment, are aspects that the interrogation documentation helped to clarify. The archive of these interrogations is also a testimony to the limits of what it was possible to establish judicially. Several questions that modern researchers consider relevant were not raised in the interrogations, either because the interrogators did not have all the information available to us today, or because the judicial process prioritized the construction of specific cases over comprehensive historical reconstruction. The gaps in the archive are, in that sense, as informative as its content. The figure of Ernst Kaltenbrunner has occupied a specific place in the historiography of the Third Reich that does not always adequately reflect his real importance within the system. For decades, the attention of researchers and the public concentrated on figures offering more accessible narratives. Himmler as the racial ideologue and builder of the SS, Heydrich as the cold-blooded architect who designed the extermination apparatus, Eichmann as the paradigm of the bureaucrat of evil that Arendt turned into a symbol of an era. Kaltenbrunner, arriving late to the theatre of the most important decisions and without the dark charisma of his predecessors, tended to remain in the background. This marginalization in historical memory contrasts with the true weight of his responsibility. Under his command, the RSHA reached its maximum operational capacity. The most massive deportations of the Holocaust occurred while he was the head of the institution that coordinated them. The execution orders for prisoners in the final months of the war bear his signature. The concentration camps within his sphere of direct influence applied the most brutal methods of the system. In statistical terms of victims, the period 1943 to 1945 under his direction surpasses in volume of killings any comparable prior phase, which makes Kaltenbrunner not an epigon of the system but its most prolific executor. Part of the historiographical problem lies in the very nature of the figure. Himmler and Heydrich left a denser ideological and rhetorical trail. Speeches, policy memoranda, texts articulating a worldview. Kaltenbrunner was essentially an operator. His written communications are predominantly functional, orders, confirmations, results reports, without the ideological scaffolding that makes other hierarchs more legible. That documentary austerity makes him a less attractive subject for certain types of historical analysis, but not a less significant one. The history of the Holocaust has an operational dimension that requires exactly the type of figure Kaltenbrunner was. someone capable of keeping an extermination machine running at full speed without any need to constantly revisit the ideological foundations of what he was doing. The most recent historiography has begun to correct that imbalance. The works of Peter Black, author of the most exhaustive academic biography of Kaltenbrunner published in 1984, and the institutional studies of the RSHA carried out by Michael Wild have contributed to situating his figure with greater precision within the machinery of extermination. What emerges from that revision is the portrait of a man who did not need to believe passionately in racial ideology to be an effective instrument of it. Loyalty to the power structure, personal ambition, and absolute indifference to the human consequences of his decisions were sufficient. The process of interrogating Kaltenbrunner was also, in a broader sense, the process of interrogating a system. The questions the investigators put to him were also questions about how the bureaucracy of state crime functions, about how individuals who in other circumstances might have led ordinary lives become executors of industrial massacres, about how the distance between the signature on a piece of paper and the body falling into a mass grave becomes the mechanism that makes crime possible on a scale that would otherwise be psychologically unsustainable. The answers Kaltenbrunner gave, both the explicit and the implicit ones, provided material for decades of historical, philosophical, and legal research. The strategy of denial he employed during the interrogations and the trial was not only a defensive tactic, it was also the first documented instance of what would become a recognizable pattern in subsequent trials for crimes against humanity. The pattern of the perpetrator who denies direct responsibility while the accumulated evidence establishes it with millimetric precision. That pattern appeared decades later in the tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, where the defendants reproduced with minor variations the same argumentative architecture: ignorance of operational details, responsibility shifted onto subordinates, presentation of one's own function as merely coordinative or informative. The comparison with Eichmann is inevitable and revealing. When Arendt attended the Jerusalem trial in 1961 and coined the expression "the banality of evil" to describe Eichmann, she was pointing to the absence of demonic depth in a man who had participated in the extermination of millions from behind his desk. Kaltenbrunner shares that characteristic with one significant difference. He was not merely a logistical executor, but an operational director with real authority over all branches of the repressive apparatus. If Eichmann was the bureaucrat of evil, Kaltenbrunner was its general manager, which does not make him more monstrous in an abstract sense, but does make him more responsible in a legal and causal sense. The interrogations ended, the verdict was pronounced, the rope was placed in the early hours of October 16, 1946, in a gymnasium in Nuremberg, before a small group of witnesses and cameras recording for history the end of one of the principal architects of mass extermination. The man who had administered the most efficient state terror of modern history died without acknowledging his victims, with the same words any Austrian of the period might have said, "Germany, good luck." The archives documenting what it was possible to obtain from him in the preceding months remain open in Washington and in Berlin, consulted each year by researchers attempting to fill the gaps those interrogations left unresolved. The figure of Kaltenbrunner, for so long eclipsed by those of his more charismatic predecessors, continues to be one of the keys to understanding how industrial extermination required neither visionaries nor fanatics at every position of command, but administrators willing to keep the machinery running without asking questions about its final destination.